I wanted to let folks know that we are recording this evening. We will pause it when there are moments for people to share if there are any personal shares, but
Mhm.
recording Adelaide's part.
Right. And so thank you very much, Christine. Christine is the manager of the bereavement department, and she is kindly serving as my tech support this evening. And Elijah is with us, who is actually making the recording. Um, and do we have, everyone's in from the waiting room right now, are they? So I'll just begin with introducing myself a little bit. My name is Adelaide Nye. And I live in Redwood Shores. So, we could have, how Zoom meetings are, we could have somebody from another country, but we're on the San Francisco Bay. And I'm a hospice volunteer with Mission Hospice and have been a hospice volunteer for, it's hard to believe, 14 years. And now I have been specialized in serving in the bereavement department and co-facilitating groups there for a little more than 6 years. And I have never gone back to direct care work. I enjoy and feel the work in bereavement is so profound. So I'm really glad to be with you this evening. Welcome, Isabel. Your Julie is there. And I thought I would take a moment just to say a little something about some of my experiences with bereavement so that you understand that I too have been through such things. I'm an only child. I happened to lose both my parents within 3 months of each other and both through hospice. And that had a lot to do with me becoming a hospice volunteer, to be perfectly honest. Um, but earlier in my life, just a few years earlier, I was diagnosed with a blood cancer. And in a matter of 4 months, I lost my job, my career, my health, my income, and my identity. So I have gone through really a major cycle. The good news is I'm still here and I actually no longer have those. I no longer seem to have this blood cancer, which no one can explain, but I'll take it. But I would just like to let you know that this is a place that I know. And many of you know it. And we are going to take a look at COVID and its impact on us in these last 2 years. And so I think with that, since most everybody's here, we'll move to screen sharing and we'll begin the presentation. By the way, you'll hear me in the background and Christine is going to be watching comments that you can make in the chat, or there's a point where we have a poll. And if you would like to participate, you can raise your hand. So we'll be working as a team to see you because it's very difficult for me to see the whole screen while also seeing the presentation. So thank you for bearing with us. And thank you, Christine. Just a moment. I need to change one thing here. Thank you for bearing with me. All right. Now we'll share screen. There we go. Thanks for your patience. So when we think about the many griefs of COVID, which we're really going to dive into, think about what can COVID teach us about loss and grief? And how can this help our lives? But also, how might we be able to better support those who are grieving around us? And the reason I'm point to that emphasis is that we are closing in on so many losses. And we'll be talking about roughly how many people are likely to be grieving as a result of that. Now, I'd like to use some couple of ways of looking at COVID. One is as a lens to understand loss and grief. And so you can see that we're looking at that in the lower left-hand corner. A lens brings us into focus, helps us understand something. We're going to also use poetry, a little bit of expressive writing, to sense into grief and wisdom about grief. Grief is difficult to just describe in words, and in many ways, poetry is very helpful. And I like what Emily Dickinson has said briefly here. A word is dead when it is said, some say. I say it just begins to live that day. Really, poetry is about living. And then finally, I'm using the image of the hot air balloon to gently float us in and out of how we will be looking at COVID. So to begin with, would like us to just experience arriving here together. And the reason is that people have had busy days and maybe are returning to work. And we're really moving into a different terrain right now. So if you don't mind, if you would put your feet flat on the ground and maybe rest your hands in your lap or on your thighs and allow your eyes to close. Just exhale a little bit. And as you take the next inhale, if you bring your shoulders up to your ears, and then as you exhale, let out a loud sigh. This small gesture is a kind of a symbol to the body that it can relax. So you might want to take another breath like that, just raising the shoulders up. And in just a moment or two like that, just a breath or two, we can suddenly become more present. And so thank you for taking the time for that. And no, I forgot. I need to stop sharing our screen for a moment. Wanted to bring a candle into view here, and to remember that we are speaking about suffering, about loss, and we want to bring our attention to those who are suffering from COVID. We want to bring our attention to those who are suffering through war in Ukraine, and just to anybody who is experiencing griefs and losses at this time. And Christine has a candle that she'll light for us. Thank you so much, Christine. We won't exactly see it with us, but you know it's in the background. Now I'll go back to sharing the screen. We'll move next to a wisdom poem to remind us about something important. It's called Eyesight. It was May before my attention came to spring. And my word, I said to the southern slopes, I've missed it. It came and went before I got right to see. Don't worry, said the mountain. Try the later northern slopes. Or if you can, climb into spring. But, said the mountain, it's not that way with all things. Some that go are gone. And that is what we're going to be speaking about tonight, the reality of things being gone in various ways from our lives because of the COVID pandemic. little bit of rules of the road together. Please listen with your heart. Kindness is how we move here. There'll be some opportunities for you to share. Um, we want you to know that emotions are always part of talking about grief, and tears are welcome here. Our sharing in the group is a bit time limited. Brevity is our goal. Please leave airtime for others. But also feel free to share, with the chat or reaction buttons. So we have more than one communication channel that we can use now. And so here's a little bit of an overview. We're going to begin by taking a poll, if you'd like to participate, of the COVID griefs that have been faced by all of us who are together this evening. And then we're going to dive a little bit further into the many, many kinds of losses, the shapes of losses, the different realities of it. And then we will shift and actually look at grief itself, some of the basics, some of the realities. And we're going to look at the topic of mourning, which you don't hear so much about anymore. It isn't a word that's used as much anymore. Mourning has changed in America. What are some of the implications of that? We'll also move into looking at how we heal from grief, what helps us to heal from grief, how we can support ourselves through grief. And also for those of you who are interested in this, how to support someone who is a COVID griever that may be in your world. We'll learn about good enough grief support and why healed grievers are so important to our world. So we're going to switch gears here and take a look at our COVID griefs and losses, descending in the balloon, if you will. Here's an overview of basically COVID grief realities today in America. I have brought in actually today's numbers as of about 2 hours ago. First of all, those of you who are in San Mateo County, many of us are, may remember that 2 days from now will be the beginning of year 3 of the COVID pandemic. So we are right at an anniversary time. Those of you who are experienced grievers know that anniversaries are rough. And when I picked this date, I had in mind this time frame. Right today, about 966,150 people have died in the United States. What's very interesting is that through careful studies, we know that about 9 people are grieving on average for every COVID death. And what that means is that there are about 8.7 million more Americans who are grieving because of COVID loss in their world. It happens to be the case that grief is complicated and lengthened by COVID. And then I want to, let us remember that we have people who've been caring for us during this time, and that resources for both the ill and the grieving are really stretched thin. And by that, I'm talking about, medical staff who are exhausted, but also the ministers, the priests, the rabbis, the social workers, the psychologists who have stepped forward and been there and tried to hold our hands through this. And also we have long haul COVID patients who need significant extra help. We're a very diverse community here in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I didn't think it would be right to not speak to some international numbers. These are from the World Health Organization. First up is Africa. It's an incredibly small number. This is a vast underestimate. I myself lived in West Africa many years ago, and the infrastructure is just not there to produce the kind of counts that we're able to produce. Asia, we're closing in on 1.3 million. Europe is closing in on 1.9 million. South America, about 1.3 million. North America, so that's Canada, United States, Mexico, etc., about coming in about 1.4 million. And then Oceania, the lovely term for including Australia, New Zealand, and all the islands, much smaller numbers. As I was thinking about this, the sentences that came to me was everyone lost something to COVID, and some lost everything. And so I want to shift gears a little bit now, and if you're willing, ask that you join us as we poll ourselves about which COVID losses we've faced. We'll just do this by a show of hands. Actually, we won't see each other, but Christine will watch and report back to us after each question what the show of hands was. So the first thing that we thought we'd ask about is if there were anyone in the group here with us tonight who's actually experienced either COVID illness in their world or COVID death.
And I'll just mention that you can literally raise your hand, or you can use the reaction of the little raise hand icon.
Yes, yes, I just saw that. I get a little message that 2 participants raised hands using the icon.
Yeah.
There's a 3rd participant. Thank you. Thank you for saying you're in the room. Second question, looking at after the death, were there people here who were, or actually as death is closing in, were there people here tonight who were prevented from being with the person who was dying, or maybe have had no memorial service yet, or it was greatly delayed, or possibly have they been grieving alone?
I see about 7 of us.
Yeah,
It's a lot.
Nearly half of our group. I think Christine, so we have a rough number of attendees. I didn't make a mental.
There are 15 of us all together this evening.
Okay, so we're about 12, so that's really very high. Do we perhaps have any healthcare workers with us tonight? People who worked through the COVID experience in healthcare?
And then we have 4 of us.
Here we are.
Yeah.
So nearly a third. The other big impact had to do with work disruption, job losses, financial insecurities. Are there those who experience this?
And then we have about 5 of us.
Quite a few.
Yeah.
And then in the category of home life disturbance, so many people were already living in worlds where they had childcare going on at home, elder care going on at home. And then suddenly Zoom work arrived at home, and all of that had to be done together. Are there people here tonight who have experienced this too?
Looks like about 8 of us.
Yeah, so now we climbed right over
Right.
half. Yes. Thank you so much for that show of hands. It is a profound part of the experience of being in a grief group is coming to understand that others in the room have been through very similar experiences. And I'm glad that those of you who were able to share did so. Thank you. This is a comment from Robert A. Niemeyer, who's the head of the Portland Institute for Loss and Transition, in other words, a pro. You almost could not design a circumstance that more greatly complicates people's grieving than COVID. We're going to talk a little bit about that. losses hit us in many different ways. But when there are disruptions to sort of the normal course of the grieving process, it really can complicate things for us. And in many ways, COVID was, one complication after another. Here are the things that we know from the research that's been done about how things like age, lifestyle, demographics, personality, race, and health, underlying health, mattered in how people were affected by COVID. First of all, of course, we know the elderly had greater medical risk, but some of you may not know that younger people suffered more anxiety and depression. And well, it's true that if your work exposed you less, or you were able to Zoom, you generally fared a little bit better. On the other hand, if you were in the front lines, it was much more difficult if you were doing labor that had you around people or around the possibility of people who hadn't, who had an unknown status. Of course, we explored this a little bit just now. Zoom work overlapping with child and elder care definitely led to more stressors. And then David Sabara reminding us that really saying something very large, it's an inescapable fact that people lower on the socioeconomic ladder are struggling more with COVID. Now, interestingly, if you were a person whose personality and to some extent life experience had built in you an ability to tolerate uncertainty and distress, it helped quite a bit. But of course, people bring various abilities to tolerate to their life experience. Clearly, people of color suffered disproportionately. Essentially, their statistics are more like this. About if you were a person of color, you had a likelihood of about 1 in 4 that you would know a COVID patient. Whereas if you were not in that category, the statistics dropped to only 1 in 10. Of course, they also face less access to personal protective equipment and also generally to care, and they experience generally worse outcomes. And we know that people with chronic illnesses, they faced increased stress and anxiety across the board, recognizing that their risk was greater. There were specific impacts that occurred around the illness and the time of death that were major. And they were generally not being able to see your loved one at the time of their illness and death, not being able to touch or hug them, or kiss the body, or accompany the body. And then there were sort of what I call serious side effects to this time period. For example, many people were desperately trying to communicate through an iPad or a cell phone with a nurse and asking the nurse to step in and act as the family and actually speak to the patient, which is also complicated for the medical staff. There was very heightened fear of COVID transmission, both in our homes, in nursing homes, retirement communities. Very big impacts there. And then the general heightened anxiety over who was going to be the next to perish. Here I'm really taking us back to 2020 and to the period before we had vaccination, when this was a very big fear, which was a little bit larger. And then, of course, there's the fact that the general day-to-day way in which we become ill did not stop happening. There were people all over the country who needed surgeries and medical procedures, and they could simply not be seen in the hospital at all. So there are people who have needed a surgery for 2 years and have been unable to have it. Then, of course, COVID had impacts on our grief rituals. In general, it was grief interrupted. Some of you have even participated in these streaming funerals, Zoomed funerals, funerals that you didn't even participate in, but you received later as a recording. Then, of course, there were the postponed funerals. The fact that you're actually at a funeral and you're maybe having a Zoom funeral. You can't hug anybody. You can't receive a hug from anybody. The memorial service meal together, the storytelling that often accompanied such times, not possible. And it's important to realize that delaying memorial services has an impact on people. It means reopening your grief at a later time. There's a reason why we, often bring our funeral ritual close to the time of death. It collapses that period of pain. When we decide to have that memorial service or even the funeral a year later, it disrupts the grieving process, and it often prolongs the pain for people. I wanted to share this very famous painting with you as a little reminder that when we lose who and what we love, it just hurts all over. And I also want to say grief is so ancient, it's so built in evolution that even some animals grieve. And this is known as the Old Shepherd's Chief Mourner. It's a painting from the 1800s from Scotland. And in fact, in Scotland, there's a statue in Edinburgh of a dog that only lived with its owner for 2 years. He was a night watchman. And that dog went every day to his grave for 16 years. And that animal has a famous statue in Scotland. So grieving is it's not an intellectual thing. It's not just an emotional thing. It's actually an evolutionary thing. I want to thank my friend and my mentor, Isabel Stenzel, for this phrase, because she suggested it to me. Why COVID losses deserve more tenderness from us. It's quite a list, but let's take a look at them. First of all, was the way it arrived like a meteor. Out of nowhere, kaboom, this landed in our lives. For many, it was unimaginable to see on TV what we were seeing, the kinds of deaths, the lines of ambulances at the hospital at certain points. Many were seeing more deaths than they have witnessed since World War II. For some people, it was a real end to the illusion, infectious diseases are no longer a threat in the modern world because we have antibiotics and everything else. It made us feel more vulnerable. Then there are the long haul COVID realities. In my research, one of the things I discovered, I did not know this, Senator Tim Kaine had COVID 2 years ago and still has leftover symptoms. Members of our government. Of course, the elders, our elders, the chronically ill, chemotherapy patients were at higher risk, but they also, some of them actually had interruptions in their care because the kind of care that they needed would be delivered sometimes in a hospital. They couldn't even access care at times. And then there's just the general exhaustion and weariness as we begin year 3. Many people just feeling very much that we want to be done with this. I want to particularly address healthcare workers, and first responders who may be in the room. Just say a little bit about the terrible burnout and the vicarious trauma and even the moral injury, to try to imagine what it's like to maybe be at the end of a 12-hour shift working inside all that PP protective gear, and to have someone on the telephone begging you to bring your phone in to the bedside and to say something on the family's behalf. That travels home with the healthcare worker, even though that person isn't their loss. So I think there's a lot being carried by our healthcare workers. Hospital staff, many of them are completely exhausted still. And we do see some nurses and doctors deciding to retire and retire early. So it says something about the impact that this is happening. Some other elements have to do with experiences that we may have had personally: increased fear, anxiety, depression, feeling of sadness, trouble sleeping, general fatigue. How about a sense of increased irritability, even back pain and headaches? These are the kinds of things that come with such stressors. In 2020, 14% of Americans indicated they had severe stress. They were interviewed. That's 3 times higher than before COVID. And of course, when you're more stressed, it interrupts your sleep, and then you begin a vicious cycle. Difficulty sleeping is also itself stressful, and it begins to go round and round. Of course, everybody felt isolation and loneliness of some sort just from being cut off from our normal social groups, but some felt much, much more. We also had a loss of access to people who are regular providers of support to us, psychologists in some cases, until we got the sort of teledoc thing going, social workers, physical therapists, even regular medical and dental care. How many people who did not get their checkups, did not know their blood pressure went up, did not know that they had 5 cavities because we stopped going for regular care? And then, as I mentioned before, the surgeries and treatments that were set aside because we couldn't go to the hospital. And then it's worth looking at some of the sociological issues. Heightened anger and anxiety, certainly over, I'll just say these 3 words, we won't explore them, but unvaccinated versus vaccinated people. Has this been politicized? If so, how you felt about it? And just the way in which COVID has revealed inequities in our system. Now, we certainly had a lot of heightened stress, but we had some very particular, more recently, areas where it's coming up. And that's the question of, are there any new COVID variants coming at us? And will the vaccination, if I have it, will it protect me? We still have unknowns there. There's been anxiety over changing health standards. Should we mask? Should we unmask? One state says to do it, another state doesn't. The actual number of cases varies in different parts of the country. It's been very confusing for people generally. Then there's even the question of, within one family, there can be differences of levels of caution. Questions of who gave grandma COVID has definitely added stress to families and brought up arguments and difficulties. And if that person died of COVID, those stressors will then move into the grieving process for the family. And then the big question, what is going to be our new normal with COVID? We really don't quite know yet, but we know that we're not living the same way that we did a mere 2 years ago. And basically, anything that overwhelms our coping is really something that's giving us a lot of trouble. And COVID has certainly done that. Another poem that I'd like to share with you. I go among trees. I go among trees and sit still. All my stirring becomes quiet around me, like circles on water. My tasks lie in their places where I left them, asleep like cattle. Then what is afraid of me comes and lives a while in my sight. What it fears in me leaves me, and the fear of me leaves it. It sings, and I hear its song. Then what I am afraid of comes. I live for a while in its sight. What I fear in it leaves it, and the fear of it leaves me. It sings, and I hear its song. And in this poem, we hear a suggestion of pulling away and seeing if it's possible to enter some silence with what frightens us. And perhaps to entertain the idea that we might find a way to work with it better by understanding it, by looking at it, which of course is very hard when we're grieving. So now some basic truths about grief, things that we know about grief, which is quite a complicated thing. But first place we always want to begin is that grief is normal, that it's a natural response to loss and the pain of great loss. Grief is actually a form of love. It's a signal to us that we have lost something that gave us great security in our lives. Importantly, grief is not a condition that needs to be treated. It needs to be allowed, to be experienced, to be felt. That said, we want to feel safe when that's happening. Needless to say, COVID took away a number of things from us that helped us to feel safe. That makes the grieving a little more difficult. It's important to understand that, excuse me, there's no right or wrong way to grieve. And another way to translate this is it's not helpful to judge another person's grief. It really doesn't help them, and it really doesn't help you. And grief is dynamic. It changes. There are moments of intense pain, and then it may, settle down for a while and then flare up again. That is its nature. What we want to remember is that everybody grieves at their own intensity, their own pace, and also grief is cultural. Some cultures, screaming and crying and flinging oneself onto the coffin is the way. And in other cultures, that is not possible. Those are cultural conditions placed on our grief. The pain underneath is the same pain. A little bit about grief misconceptions. I'm just going to go through these quickly because everything on this page is wrong. Grief progresses smoothly, step by step. No. Grief has an expiration date and then your grief is over. Also, no. We'll address this more in a moment. Tears are a sign of weakness. Definitely not. Tears are a sign that great emotion is moving through the body. And when the body and the person lets it move through, there's a release. If you express intense feelings, you're losing control. Not something that we want to tell someone who's grieving. Or if you feel crazy, it means you're going crazy. A lot of the experience of grief is feeling kind of crazy. Knowing that helps. And that great grief anger means you don't believe in God anymore, or that you no longer trust your religion. No, there's just things that we call grief bursts. And when they come, we get very upset. But it doesn't mean that our underlying view of the world just goes out the window. And certainly not, we do not agree with the idea that you should just stop thinking about it and move on. Those are misconceptions. There are some other deep grief truths we want to take a look at. You know, our love for people and pets, we have many loves, birds, one of my loves, and our attachments to homes, to towns, to friends from high school. They are varied, but they help us to feel safe and secure in the chaos of the world. And COVID has been the visitation of chaos in our lives. And so when we have a great loss in the midst of the pandemic, really shakes us, it shatters our confidence. And that causes the pain of grief to arise. But even as our love is unique, so too is our grief. Really, the work of grief is to accept the reality of the death when that is the scale of the grief. And that means really working with it on an intellectual, emotional, physical, and practical level. That is the actual work of grief. Interestingly, in recent years, researchers have moved away from thinking that acceptance is the goal. Really don't look at it that way so much anymore. We really today want to bring the question of finding meaning inside whatever has been grieved, whatever has been lost, whatever this death or loss is. How can we derive meaning from it? That is a wiser goal. And in our grief groups here at Mission Hospice, we work toward that kind of goal. And also that grief moves and changes with time. It will and does shift slowly from intense pain to eventual integrated loss. But the pace varies with each person. So it's really not useful to set any timers. We don't recommend that. This is a very well-traveled subject in the world of bereavement. What are the 4 major tasks of grief? The first, accept the reality of our loss. It happened. The second is to process the pain of our grief, which really means to sort of be with ourselves as all these emotions and upset and fear and great difficulty moves through us day after day until it begins to move on. We need to adjust to life without the deceased, or without what we've lost that gave us security, a security we once felt. This takes quite some time to adjust to. Knowing that helps. And importantly, is in grieving a death, is to find an enduring connection with who or what we so love and we so deeply miss. A connection that can travel with us into the future. Some people call it embedding your beloved in your heart. If they're in your heart, then they go everywhere with you. Grief. Yes, it is a strange pain. It is one of the most painful experiences a human being can go through without an actual wound to the physical body. And it does last quite some time. So it's very strange in that way. It's also accompanied by physical pain. It's extremely common for people who are grieving death or losses to experience back pain, joint pain, headaches, stiffness. There's actually a reason for this. There's an overwhelming amount of stress in the body, and stress hormones are released by that, and they actually produce those pains. And something else that's worth understanding uh, is that grief really produces a lot of upset and tears just over having to continue to experience it day after day. So people who are grieving deeply, who really want an escape from the pain of grief, and that's actually very difficult to simultaneously be stuck in it and to want to escape it. But it is part of the shape and the feeling of grief. And in this poem called Father, maybe we touch this a little bit. Um, it goes like this. Father, there is a hole in my back where your hand did not rest, where your skin did not sense your presence, where the bone did not grow to meet your touch. Here I stand, shoulders slumped, protected heart, unsure in the world. Father, our Father, now I see there's a hole in your back too. And what this poem brings up for me, and the reason that I wanted to place it here is again looking back at the endless evolution of grief, that going back through all our ancestors, they all grieved. 200,000 years ago, they grieved. Apes and primates grieve. So this is an old thing. And when we can touch that a little bit, we can remember that we're not alone. Now, there are secondary losses that come from a major primary loss, and here I will speak of death. And we'll just go around the list, but some people, maybe they don't lose their job, but maybe the person who died was the one that had a job. And then we come moving around clockwise to a loss of income, which often can happen with a death. It's a complete change of future plans. Everything that you thought you would do with that person is now off the table. Sometimes it can shift connections in families, connections with friends. Occasionally, when it's seen that when a spouse is lost, you don't get those dinner invitations from the couple that you used to hang out with so often. Friendships can shift. Often family dynamics shift when there's a parent loss. Suddenly, perhaps one of the siblings becomes the eldest can become, the next person in charge, and there could be other siblings who do not like that. And of course, there's the question of identity. When we have a relationship with someone, we had a role in relationship to them. We were their daughter, we were a sister, we were a son, and all of a sudden we do not have those roles anymore. These are secondary losses that come along with grief. And then this is one that's sometimes we don't hear spoken about enough, but is particularly large, I think, with COVID. And that's that losses can accumulate. And so I threw in this picture of that, horrendous set of drawers to remind us of the different kinds of things that are unresolved at times. We call that cumulative grief. Griefs accumulate when one person experiences multiple losses, and they either happen all at once or they're happening so quickly one after another that they can't process the first loss. And that causes the grief to accumulate. And that definitely means that your grieving could take longer. So if you think about what's happened to you through the COVID period and you think about your losses, if you have cumulative losses, this is something to keep in mind. COVID brought us loss after loss after loss after loss after loss. And it was kind of like a 2-year-long landslide of cumulative losses. I like what Earl Grolman says about this. Grief is not a disorder. It's not a disease or a sign of weakness. It is an emotional, physical, and spiritual necessity. It's the price you pay for love. The only cure for grief is to grieve. And these are that last sentence is deeply, deeply true. And then from Nick Cave, grief is tidal. In time, it can recede and leave us with feelings of peace and advancement, only for it to wash back in with its crushing hopelessness and sorrow. And that's kind of the way of grief. And it is helpful just to understand those dynamics, because it all of a sudden you realize it's the grief that is making this happen, and it's not you coming unglued. So we put this in the category of grief education, those of us who were in the bereavement department. So how do people heal from grief? Well, with time and support, what happens really is that we grow, and we grow larger than our grief. So if you look at this little graphic of this nice plant, and I love that it's a plant, because plants just grow. That's what they do. You can see that the grief hasn't really changed in size, but the plant has grown larger. And of course, the suggestion here is that we are that plant. But we don't just grow larger. I think very often we grow wiser, and we grow more resilient. And there are many side benefits to that. But that's basically how it takes place. So we're going to have an opportunity now to just have a few minutes to do something called expressive writing. It's going to be a little descent in our balloon. Expressive writing is a healing methodology that's been shown to be effective in over 30 years of testing across 6 continents. Yes, it works with everybody. But it's a certain kind of writing. It's a way of writing where you say how things really are. You tell the good and the bad. That's what makes expressive writing work. They've done studies, and when they taught people to only write about the good things and leave the bad things out, they never got the healing from it. So we're going to have an opportunity to do that, and I'll explain a bit about this next. You'll want to grab a pen and a piece of paper, or your tablet or laptop, and we'll have a moment for you to do that. And I will just explain a little bit about how it's going to work. We want to create a little space before you write. And so we're going to have a moment of silence. It's not starting yet while you go get your pen and paper. So we'll have a moment of silence. It'll begin with a tone, alarm, and then we'll end with one. And then with the end of the silence, you'll be given 6 minutes to write. And you're asking yourself, what am I going to write about? And of course, we're going to provide you with something called a prompt. A prompt is a question or a sentence that you're asked to just interact with. And you will select which one calls to you. There will be 4 of them. And Christine is kindly going to drop them into the chat, but we're going to see them on the next slide. And what I'll ask you to do, if you haven't done this before, is literally just put your fingers on the laptop, put your pen on the paper, figure out which one really speaks to you, and just go. That's the method. So if you would mute yourself now, I'm going to begin I'm going to show us the prompts here so that you can look at them, but they'll also be in the chat. And we'll begin a moment of silence, not quite yet. So I'm going to read each of the prompts first. One is just make a list or just shortly, briefly describe the emotions you felt since your COVID loss. You might even want to take a moment and say, my COVID loss was. Actually, that's during the 1 minute of silence, you could think, what was it in the last 2 years that really is the thing that was my deep COVID loss? So if you'll ponder that when we start the moment of silence, the 1 minute of silence. Second prompt is to make 2 lists about that COVID loss. And you could draw a line down the middle of the page, and top of one on the left column, I don't accept, and on the right column, I accept. And write about what that loss brings up for you, what it's difficult to accept about it, or what you can accept about it. Third question is to ponder when your grief about this COVID loss comes up. What triggers it? Sometimes we will notice that a certain thing happens and bam, we're off to the races. It's important actually to notice those. And if you've been noticing them, this can be a helpful list. Just list them, describe the triggers. And then the last question, no human being can do grief alone. We need others to support us in our COVID grief journey. And the question is asked to write about who is there to truly hear me. So that's something that you could look at. So I'm going to set the timer now for 1 minute.
Before you do that, I'm going to ask, I put these same prompts in the chat, and they're up on the video.
Oh,
and Elijah, our education manager, if you would pause the recording here.
Thank you, Elijah. All right, let me get back into the business of sharing screens. So we're going to come back up from that exercise, which really took us into an interior space. And we're going to take a look at what mourning is. Not a word that we hear very often in our society these days. Mourning can mean 2 things, but one that it generally understood meaning is the time you take after a death to reflect on the death, to come to terms with it, and to readjust to life. You could say mourning is the period during which you do your grieving. So it's a very hard time in someone's life when they're mourning. Now, mourning used to be a ritual in the United States. It used to be something that we could see that other people were going through. And why would we have such rituals? Well, people have known actually for thousands and thousands of years that death and loss happen. And frankly, it wasn't all that long ago that seeing death fairly regularly was rather normal. And so people who lived more closely to death, our predecessors, they realized that grievers needed kindness to heal. And since grief was something that they saw happening around them, they wanted to be ready to give kindnesses when they would meet a grieving person. And so in the United States, there were a set of rituals. This is going back into, well, it probably continued into the early 1900s, was that people would wear a symbol that would let you know that they were mourning. Widows would wear a black dress every day for a year. Men would put a black armband on. That was a symbol that you were grieving, that the society was meant to treat you carefully. And it was very typical for those major griefs loss of spouse or children, and possibly parents, was to grieve for a year. Um, these symbols gave us a chance to see who was grieving. It triggered in us the sense that, oh, I could be kind, I could offer support here. So that was then. Those who grieve today are often invisible. In the United States, anyway, our older mourning symbols and rituals, with the exception of funeral and memorial services, have largely fallen away. We don't identify someone as grieving by what they wear. And so basically, I would like to propose that every time that we go shopping, we are surrounded by people who are grieving. We just don't know that they're grieving. And one of the challenges that has happened in our society is that when we don't know someone is grieving, we don't talk about grieving. When we don't have death so close to us, death is something that is kind of handled in maybe a funeral home type situation. And so families don't talk about grieving. Young people don't learn what grieving is. I myself was raised that way. And so effectively, we have had some loss of cultural wisdom in our country. The knowing of how to help has left in some ways as we've lost these mourning rituals. And the truth is, grievers are actually hiding all around us. And I emphasize the word hiding because when you're grieving, you are in great pain, and you do not wish, generally speaking, to show vulnerability, to show a lot of tears, to show a crumpled face. It is a form of grief, but for me, it happened when I was sick. But I was being regularly seen at the Stanford Cancer Center, and I had a bone marrow biopsy, which can be rather uncomfortable. I was so upset that I was afraid to go out through the waiting room. I didn't want anyone to see me crying because everybody else there was quite ill too. And I moved from empty treatment room to empty treatment room for nearly 30 minutes while I tried to pull myself together. So part of it was that I didn't want to be seen that way, but part of it was I didn't want to bum anybody else out. So I want to speak to how grievers feel inside. And I want to honor the fact that they're experiencing a lot of pain. There are not a lot of safe places to express it. And so we see increased isolation. We see people feeling lonely. We know people are uncertain who to share their grief with. This poem by the wonderful Denise Levertov hints at how you might work with your grief. Talking to grief. Ah, grief, I should not treat you like a homeless dog who comes to the back door for a crust, for a meatless bone. I should trust you. I should coax you into the house and give you your own corner, a warm mat to lie on, your own water dish. You think I don't know you've been living under my porch. You long for your real place to be readied before winter comes. You need your name, your collar and tag. You need the right to warn off intruders, to consider my house your own, and me your person, and yourself my own dog. And so for those of us who love animals, and a homeless dog touches our heart, well, we should not allow our own griefs to be treated as if they were a homeless dog that no one wants to let in. We do better when we treat ourselves with kindness and care. And that helps us transition to the question of, well, how the grieving can help themselves. Um, there is something called mindful self-compassion that is being taught now for about the last 5 years. And it is a powerful technique, which when practiced can bring forms of soothing. But part of how it works is making a decision to be kind to yourself. That's kind of like step one. And then you use your attention as best you can to notice how your kind of thoughts you're having, what kind of emotions you're feeling, where you feel them in the body, and how you're treating yourself. And the idea is that if you would pay attention, you would notice how you were thinking, you might notice that it wasn't very nice. It wasn't very kind to yourself. And so mindful self-compassion teaches questions like this. What am I thinking? Is it self-criticizing or is it kind? If it's self-criticizing, it may be time to turn to a new thought, or to get up and change gears, or to go for a walk. Another interesting question, how do I treat my body? Am I exhausted? Am I numbing myself? Is there a lot of TV? Is there a lot of alcohol and drugs? Or might I be able to make a choice for just simpler forms of rest or self-care? And importantly, because grief brings up so many feelings, how am I treating my feelings? When I notice that I feel simultaneously angry and scared, do I resist these feelings? Do I deny them and walk away? Or could I find a way to allow myself to go, oh, that's what's coming up now? So mindful self-compassion is just one method that includes learning ways to actually feel peaceful. And by that, I'm speaking about, it teaches you ways, it's surprising, to put your hand on yourself that can actually bring calm. Some of you may have already experienced this. You might experience that when you feel upset, if you put your hand on your heart, you might notice that that's helpful. But there's a period in the training where you actually learn what your particular touches are. For me personally, the lightest placement of my hands on my cheeks and face and closing my eyes brings me an amazing form of relief that shocked me the first time I experienced it. So the other flip side of the point that we want to make is, fighting with the feelings of your loss, the emotions, the body experiences, the thoughts, fighting with them really only makes life harder when you're grieving. A little bit more grief wisdom here from Helen Keller, who knew a thing or two about grief. We bereaved are not alone. We belong to the largest company in all the world, the company of those who have known suffering. And then such a beautiful one, grief shared is grief diminished. And two anonymous ones, deeply carrying wisdom. You walk through grief one day at a time. Each day of survival is a triumph. And finally, where there is love, there is no parting. Just take a moment to point out the role that beauty can play. Maybe you can listen to my voice while you actually look at the image that's here and kind of see if you can fall into it for a moment. Beauty is a kind of very interesting balm that can bring momentary relief. Even the tear-drenched soul is uplifted a bit by beauty. You can bring beauty to the griever, or you can bring them to the beauty. But when you expose yourself to beauty, which can also be just nature, joy can quickly follow for a moment. So there can be some relief from um, going to look at a flower, walking to the window and noticing the clouds. There are simple things that allow a little bit of gear shifting to occur. I highly recommend beauty. I do not know how I would have gone through the many difficulties I've been through if I did not have beauty in my pocket. And then this poem hints a little bit at uh, something similar, Cutting Loose by the great William Stafford. Sometimes from sorrow, for no reason, you sing. For no reason, you accept the way of being lost, cutting loose from all else and electing a world where you go where you want to. Arbitrary, a sound comes, a reminder that a steady center is holding all else. If you listen, that sound will tell where it is, and you can slide your way past trouble. Certain twisted monsters always bar the path, but that's when you get going best. Glad to be lost, learning how real it is here on earth again and again. And so partly a sense of solidarity with the mystery of grief. We do learn, we grow, we can become stronger. I take a moment to just say that I believe healed grievers are some of the most important people on our planet. They have something really rich to give back to life and to us because they've directly experienced deep loss. And as a result, grievers are often more compassionate people, more resilient people, and we need people like that. Evolution has proven that we humans can become stronger after great pain when it's integrated into felt experience, when we really work to be present to it at the body, at the emotions, at the thoughts, and for some of us, even perhaps in a spiritual dimension. Ancient traditions really agree about this. And so I believe we all benefit when grievers return fully to life. So I wanted to add into this program because I felt very touched by the scale of COVID grief in our country. What if we knew someone in our circle who was a COVID griever, one way or another? Doesn't have to be so dramatic that they either had COVID or had a COVID death. They had some of the griefs that we polled ourselves about from the beginning. How would we support someone? Well, first, I think it's important to look at our own fears and needs, particularly if it is a death that is in question. Because we each have some fear of death and loss, and it's important that we admit it. It's a natural thing, and it even has a name in psychology. It's called existential dread. We are the only animals on the planet that know that we come to an end. And so, this awareness, there's a heaviness to it for human beings. And also, there's denial too. Denial is a very important part of actually surviving a human life. Denial gets us through when whatever is going on is just too much for us to deal with. And so, as we think about supporting a COVID griever, we might keep in mind that we might have some denial going, and that denial might not just be with the griever. And I think it's really important to ask ourselves the question: do we have enough gas in our own tank? Have we had so many COVID losses that we really can't help now? I think these are some of the places that are important to reflect on first. And then the second part is, let's take a look at the normal anxious thoughts that come up when we think of daring to support a grieving person. Remember, this is the context of America in the 21st century, where most people don't experience death very frequently, and most people don't really know how to support someone who's grieving, or often they don't. So we have anxious thoughts that come up when we think of wanting to support somebody. These are some that, as I really thought carefully about it, came up for me. What if I say the wrong thing? What if I intrude at the wrong time? What if I inadvertently hurt their feelings or make them cry? None of us would want to do any of that. But when someone's grieving, those things can happen. What I found personally was something that stood in the way for me was, what if what I could offer seems just too small compared to the scale of their pain? I felt in myself the sense I didn't want to let them down. And that brought me to something that I'm toying with, and I'm stealing directly from the world of psychiatry. But I think that there might just be something called good enough grief support. And to explain what that means, I have to touch for a moment on a concept from psychiatry, deeply respected, known to be true, and it's called the good enough mother. And it's this understanding that children need their mother, whoever's taking care of them closely, to actually fail them a certain percentage of the time and in ways that are tolerable to the child, so the child can learn to live in an imperfect world. I must say, when I first ran across this notion, it touched me very profoundly. I mentioned earlier, I believe, that I am an only child. And so that's a whole different kind of space where there's a lot of attempt to give you a perfect world. And I lived in an upbringing like that, which had many benefits. But when I first came to understand this concept, I was deeply affected by it, because some of my world was so perfect that I slammed into a lot of walls after I entered life as an adult. So I like to propose the idea that there's also such thing as good enough grief support. You see, every griever must also readjust and eventually return to an imperfect world. Perfect grief support doesn't reflect the real world that will face them. And so basically, we're off the hook. And this is what I would like to suggest as good enough grief support. Small acts of kindness and caring that are just good enough. Yes, they may be imperfect, but they still help with the healing. They really fall into this little threesome: caring, listening, and accompaniment, which simply means being with in a very deep way. And these can often actually be just enough, even though they're imperfect. Another context about the griever that I think we must keep in mind, I emphasized from the very beginning, this is not a process that requires medical help. It's a natural process. And so here's some wisdom about how we can help someone who's grieving. We are not responsible for healing their grieving. What they're going through is a natural but painful and longer process, which does heal deep losses. So we need to remember that every griever is healing on their own from the inside out by slowly growing into new strengths and new forms of resilience. We're helpful in supporting a griever when we realize this, and we can just sit next to them and know that we don't have to repair them. We just need to support. And so here's a list of simple actions. I find the simplest ones really do go a long way. We don't contradict. We don't tell people how they should be feeling or they shouldn't be feeling. We certainly don't do that. We do hold a hand. We do hug. We do send loving emojis in a text. We try to demonstrate caring. We send a card, we make a call. If we can on a regular basis, they are so appreciated. But even a card, I find myself just slowed down by wanting to say the right things in the card. I have learned from the others who have taught me that the card might contain a snippet of poetry that you cut out and stick in the card. Maybe you just pen a wise quote, or maybe a simple "I care." Small acknowledgements of grief can be enough. Of course, we can bring soup and bread. We can bring flowers and music when the time is right. We can bring a song. We can invite people to visit a garden with us. We can go on a stroll with them. We can say, would you like to go outside and watch the clouds? And now there's a chance for us to actually share again if you would like to do that. No assumption that you will share. But if you have grieved a death, if you would ponder for a moment what one action most helped your deep grief. I'll stop the sharing for a moment here so we can see each other. If people want to reflect and think about what was that thing that a family member, a friend, it might have been the cashier at Safeway. It's amazing how we can be touched by people we don't even know when we're grieving. So if you'd like to share popcorn style, it can take a couple of minutes.
Elijah, let's pause the recording again here and just give folks some privacy. Thank you.
Thank you for what was shared. Profound. Christine, I have that funny feeling that a slide has been missed, but we're going to just go with it. We did want to create a little time at the end here. We're not quite to closing. We have a few other things that we're going to do. There's a poem, but as we're moving in that direction, I wanted to give you an opportunity to just take a minute right now and to check in, if you would like, using the chat to offer 3 adjectives that describe how you're feeling right now. If we were in an 8-week-long group, we would be seeing each other on the screen with greater ease. We would have a lot of nonverbals to understand better, but I wanted to just check in, see what's coming up for people, how people are feeling right now. Saw Janet said connected, peaceful, content. Thank you. Warmly connected. Lovely. It's a complicated subject. We have many different things that we can feel about it, and in part, how we might feel could be a function of what's going on in our own lives now, or even what our COVID losses have been. So I wanted to just create an opportunity for someone to speak up. Oh, Isabel, let's see. There are some more. Alexa, contemplative and introspective. Good to hear. Thank you for sharing that. Julia, supported, calm. Isabel, touched by beauty as a salve to grief. Appreciative of your gifts, Adelaide. Thank you. Some relief that the hardest part of COVID is behind us, we hope. Really. Some relief. It feels like we could touch it a little bit. Roseanne, grateful, hopeful, calmer. Susie, pensive, aware, and seen. Wow. I would like to share that I feel accompanied by you all. That feels good. We don't know who iPad 3 is, but better understanding. Glad to hear that. And of course, for any of you, if you're thinking of sharing and you think that the list is too positive and you don't want to put how you're really feeling in there, I would like to suggest that expressing ourselves is also part of healing. So if anyone feels that way, feel free to drop it in the chat as well. But it's definitely a sense of connection, warmth, and that somehow the looking at this subject is possible without great discomfort, which is good. I appreciate what has been shared. We'll go to the next slide. I did want to, as we come to a close, I loved this quote, a doctor's perspective on COVID. Our country can be united by seeing this COVID suffering. We are all my patient, and we are all his wife. Our collective grief, varied as our reactions to it may be, can bind us together when it seems like nothing else will. It is one lens through which we can recognize our shared humanity. None of this prevents life from moving forward, but it's our best shot at bringing everybody along. And I think Dr. Sunita Puri is saying something profound with half of that last sentence, our best shot at bringing everybody along. Because when people are suffering in grief and not getting the support that they need, and of course, we've talked about how COVID has made grief much more difficult. It's a harder trip, and we want to bring everybody along. So I'm very grateful to Dr. Sunita Puri. And by the way, she was a frontline doctor during COVID. And our next slide, want to ask you if you would please complete our evaluation form, which you'll receive tomorrow. We really do want to know whether we've been helpful, whether you have any suggestions or ideas. We would love for you to share them with us. Isabel, let's return to beauty for a moment. I wanted to put this slide in here just so that we could actually all together look at something that many people would consider beautiful. And perhaps just take a second and allow yourself to fall into the image. The sun setting, maybe imagining the sound of the waves, the way this has gone on and on for millennia, something everlasting actually in this image. And so my wish for you is that you will remember that beauty and nature are terrific balms when it comes to healing us and helping us, if we wish, if we feel called to perhaps step forward and sometimes support others who are grieving. Pardon me. And we're coming to our closing poem, and then I will end the presentation. We'll see each other again. It's a favorite of mine called Forever Oneness. And this is by an Aboriginal poet from Australia named B. Lake. Forever oneness, who sings to us in silence, who teaches us through each other. Guide my steps with strength and wisdom. May I see the lessons as I walk, honor the purpose of all things. Help me touch with respect, always speak from behind my eyes. Let me observe, not judge. May I cause no harm and leave music and beauty after my visit. When I return to forever, May the circle be closed and the spiral be broader. And so I think we've had a sense of the circle here, even though this has been Zoom and there have been slides. I want to thank you for being with us this evening. I ask that you take kind care of yourselves tonight. We've talked about a lot of things. They are now resident in your unconscious. They may filter into dreams, etc. So it's a good evening to take it a little on the easy side. Here we are back again. If anybody has anything for a close that they want to say, you could say that or put it in the chat. We have reactions that are available too. I can say that what it's been like for me to be with you has been like this. I have appreciated everything that has been shared. And I feel that we have a sense of community that we've built for just a few moments. And that really can change everything. So thank you so much for this evening.